Hello, and welcome to a lecture on the Cold War. Today we're going to discuss a time period that lasts from the end of World War II all the way up until the end of the Soviet Union, which was in 1991. So the Cold War is a series of different events that were associated with communism versus capitalism. So the Cold War is really an ideological war. Here's what the AP wants you to know. So it wants you to know about the military conflicts occurring on an unprecedented global scale that's associated with World War I and World War II. In regards to the Cold War, it says that the global balance of economic and political power shifted after the end of World War II and rapidly evolved into the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, which led to ideological struggles between capitalism and communism throughout the globe. So what the Cold War is basically this time period where the USSR and the Soviet Union were competing as superpowers. So those who were aligned with the US were called first world countries. Those who were aligned with the Soviet Union were called second world countries. And your third world countries were countries that tried not to take a side. And that didn't really work out well for them because they end up underdeveloped, they end up not economically stable, and they end up very unindustrialized. We don't use those terms anymore because the Cold War is over. So in order to understand the Cold War, we have to look at the impact of World War II. The series of conferences, which was somewhat discussed with World War II, was dealing with what kind of world are we going to have after this massive war. One of the first conferences was the Atlantic Conference. This was in 1941, which predates the U.S. entrance into the war. The United States didn't enter World War II until Pearl Harbor happened in 1942. So even though we were isolationists for the majority of the war, and even though the United States was not readily involved in World War II and was trying to prevent being involved in World War II, Churchill and FDR met anyway, and they created what's called the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter is an outline of what will become the United Nations. So it's agreements about things like the international water laws, or how to deal with POWs, and different things like that that the UN now actually regulates. In December of 41 and into January of 42, so this is after Pearl Harbor, we're officially in the war, we have a conference called Arcadia. And this is where FDR renames the Allied powers the United Nations. So the United Nations was, the term was actually meant for the countries that were against the Nazi expansion in Europe and into the Middle East. So the Allied powers changed their name to United Nations, and these countries will obviously be the first members of the United Nations. In Moscow in 1943, the powers met and created the Moscow Declaration. It stated, the evidence of atrocities, massacres, and cold-blooded mass executions which are being perpetrated by Hitlerite forces in many of the countries they have overrun and from which they are now being steadily expelled, will be judged on the spot by the peoples whom they have outraged. This is saying that Hitler and everything associated with mass killings of the Jews associated with the Holocaust, they will be tried. That anybody who was involved in the mass executions will actually go in front of a tribunal and will be tried for their crimes against humanity. So this is the first time we start developing what will become the UN definition of genocide. This is the first time we start talking about ethnic cleansing. Previously, those terms were not something that anybody talked about. So things that were happening in Armenia were not necessarily associated with a genocide or an ethnic cleansing. And the first time we use the term genocide is to apply to the Jewish Holocaust. So the Moscow Conference is where to set the stage for what will become the International Court. Here's some propaganda associated with the United Nations. Things to note for this propaganda is what flag is on top and out front. Of course, that's ours. Okay? Underneath them is our allies, Great Britain. So you can see that obviously the British and the US are leading the way in this united front. You can see that the Soviet Union flag, the red one with the sickle and hammer, is still out front, but it is smaller. It's kind of in the background. So that is kind of setting the stage for what will become the Cold War. And you can see all of the British allies, most of the Commonwealth flags are in this propagandist picture. And the idea is that the United Nations was at first united against the Nazis, but of course will become an important power in the modern age. So to continue with our conferences, you have a Cairo conference in November of 1943 between Churchill, FDR, and Xi Yang, the leader of Communist China. Not Communist China, the leader of the Republic of China. So there's no Stalin. Stalin is not in this conference. There started to be a little bit of ideological tensions as we got through the conferences and as we started to finish World War II. Stalin was becoming aggressive about land that he wanted. Stalin was becoming a little bit more controversial in regards to the Allies being allied with him. It made them nervous. It made the capitalist countries very nervous to have this friend in Stalin. And the whole point of the Cairo conference was dealing with Japan. They said that Japan will be stripped of all the islands in the Pacific, which she has seized or occupied since the beginning of the First World War in 1914. So it means any imperialist expansion that Meiji Japan had begun in the Pacific Islands, so we're talking Iwo Jima, Midway, the Philippines, all those islands, Japan was going to lose control of those islands. In addition, all territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese, including Manchuria, Formosa, and a bunch of other territories, will be restored to the Republic of China. So again, Stalin's missing. That is evidence of Che Yang not being a communist. So even though Mao Zedong is kind of showing up in China at this point, and China is slowly becoming communist, this is proof that the capitalists are very wary of the communist expansion. And they didn't want Stalin there because Stalin would have supported the communist movement in China. So you can see the tensions building already. The Cairo conference also states that no one is allowed to go into Asia again. Imperialism is over. Empire building is not okay anymore. It is not okay to expand over, inferior people, or that social Darwinist idea is no longer okay. Tehran was held in 1943. This is where our final battle plans are decided. This is where they start doing things like island hopping and D-Day and all that kind of stuff. Bretton Woods was in July of 1944. 44 nations were present at this conference, and this is where they developed the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. The purpose of these two programs was to rebuild Europe after the war. One of the failures of World War I and one of the failures of the Paris Peace Conference was letting the countries have to rebuild themselves. There was way more war damage with World War II. We were bombing cities, we were blowing things up, entire cities and civilizations were leveled, and so there was a huge amount of rebuilding that had to take place. There's no way that the German economy would withstand another reparation issue or having to rebuild on their own. Now, what the IMF the IMF still exists today. A lot of your less developed countries will apply to the IMF for loan money today and to try to develop their industrialization and whatnot. But the original purpose of the IMF was rebuilding from World War II. We have another conference in August of 1944. We have 39 countries who made it to the conference, and this is the establishment of the United Nations. This is where we officially have the creation of the UN. They signed this charter. The UN officially exists as of the end of August 23rd, 1944, with 39 member nations. Yalta was in 1945. This is where we're going to figure out, where the powers are going to figure out how to officially end Hitler and defeat Germany. This is where they're going to lay out their plans for bombing Berlin. They're also going to figure out what the heck are we supposed to do after the war. Where are the borders? What's going to happen with all that? They're going to create the date for the first UN conference. And they're putting conditions on the Soviet Union's entry into the war with Japan. So when the United States needed help with getting Japan out of Korea and out of Manchuria. So we needed the Soviet Union to come from the north, liberate North Korea, and maybe help with Manchuria. Obviously, we're going to drop the bomb, and Stalin does not necessarily get into China and into Korea as far as maybe he had wished. And that's going to create problems in this post-World War II era in Asia, where the different ideologies between communism and capitalism are fighting. Stalin wanted to get into the Pacific War earlier than the Allied powers were letting him, because he wanted to influence the Korean government, and he wanted to influence the Chinese government. We have our first international UN conference from April to June of 1945. We get 50 nations who signed the UN Charter, so that is the creation of the UN there. And then Potsdam was held in 1945 as well, and this is where they decide on the unconditional surrender of Japan. They figure out how to deal with Germany. This is where they set up things like the denazification program, the trials that they're going to do in Germany associated with trying all the Nazis who were associated with the Holocaust. And they split Germany into 4 zones. So Germany is going to be split between the US, Britain, France, and the USSR. And the capital is also going to be split into East Berlin and West Berlin. East Berlin is going to belong to the Soviet Union. West Berlin is going to belong to the democratic powers. What's going to end up happening is the democratic sides are going to combine their areas into what will be Germany. They help them establish a democracy, have elections, and that kind of stuff. Where East Berlin and some of Eastern Germany is going to remain under control of the USSR, and that's going to have a huge impact on events with the Cold War. Just to kind of review what the AP wants, Part D of 6.24 says that the Cold War produced new military alliances, including NATO and Warsaw, and promoted proxy wars in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So the next several slides are going to talk about NATO and Warsaw, and then we're going to go through all the proxy wars, first in Asia, I think, and then into Latin America, and then into Africa. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is basically the United States and all of our nice European best friends. So members agree to defend each other if anyone is attacked. It's created as a result of an event called the Berlin Blockade. In 1948 to 49, the USSR started to block the Allied access into Berlin. Remember, Berlin was split into East and West. And so what Stalin was trying to do was to close down Berlin, the capital of Germany, and provide everything that the Berliners needed so that maybe the Germans would side with him. He was trying to make Germany communist. So he blockades the capital, and of course the USSR is struggling to meet basic needs, so they don't have food, they don't have water, they don't have the basic needs for the Berliners. And so what the Allied powers do, or the NATO powers do, is they do our first airlift. They fly a plane over and they drop goods and products and food and everything, the necessary goods, to the citizens of Berlin. So instead of Stalin saving the day, NATO saves the day. And so obviously the Germans are going to kind of ally with those NATO powers versus the communist powers. Communism doesn't work here. And Stalin, it's kind of hugely embarrassing for Stalin. He's not able to provide for the needs of the Berliners, and it's one of Stalin's first aggressive moves. And so NATO says, no, Stalin, you're not getting away with this. Okay. So the NATO Secretary General stated that the goal of NATO was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. There was an opportunity for the Germans. Most of the Germans supported the fascist ideology. They were Nazis. They loved Hitler. They loved his ideologies. As the U.S. was, and the other NATO powers were in Germany trying to denazify the German citizens, the fear was that the German citizens would rally, unite, create World War III. They lacked a leader. There was no Hitler to kind of organize them, so that wasn't going to happen. And the denazification program was very, very, very effective. Okay, the United States is really good at propagandizing the idea of democracy. We've done it in other places as well. We were very successful at it in Japan. We were very successful at it in South Korea, and we're very successful at it in Germany as well. The only time the mutual defense article of the NATO conference was actually applied was after 9/11. So the only time we've ever come together as an alliance with all of our PFFs in Europe was after 9/11 in the war on terrorism, which isn't a war on a state. So it's a little bit different than the treaties associated with World War I and World War II. The Warsaw Pact was founded in May of 1955. It's a mutual defense treaty between the 8 communist states and the satellite states in Eastern Europe. So this is Stalin and his best friends. So we have official lines drawn. You have your NATO allies, which is all of our friends, and then we have the communist states, which is Stalin and all of his friends.
This map shows you the members of both NATO and Warsaw. The red are going to be Warsaw, your blue are going to be NATO, and then your gray are going to be neutral. Notice Austria and Switzerland are trying to stay out of things. They're looking pretty successful at staying out of things. Also, Yugoslavia, which is a new country, is not going to be involved in this at all.
The Berlin Wall is not the Iron Curtain. A lot of times students mistake these two different things. The Iron Curtain is just a metaphor for Warsaw versus NATO. NATO still exists. Warsaw obviously does not anymore because the USSR is done. Proxy wars. A proxy war is basically where the USSR and the United States were promoting their ideologies. So you have communism versus capitalism, and our first proxy war is in Korea. The Korean War officially is fighting from 1950 to 1953. The Korean War is technically still happening. They have an armistice that says that they're not going to blow each other up, but that's it. They never signed a peace treaty. The Korean War is technically still happening. This is the USSR is going to support your communist government in the north. The south has an elected government, obviously helped by the United States as we occupied both Japan and South Korea. Truman, basically the idea, now that appeasement didn't work with Hitler, so people are super afraid of just letting North Korea exist and letting it be communist. This is our first attempt of what's called containment. The United States had a policy where we were going to contain communism. We were not going to allow it to spread, and the Korean War is an example of that. So basically Truman said, hey, let's go take out the North Koreans. The North Koreans are communists. Remember that North Korea is going to be liberated by Stalin and his forces. They helped get the Japanese out of North Korea, so it would make sense that that government that was set up was a communist government. But in the government that we set up for South Korea was a democratic government, capitalist government. So Truman says, let's go take out the communists in the north. The U.S. and UN forces led by General MacArthur. MacArthur is important for World War II. He was associated with the occupation of both Japan and Korea in the post-war era and helps create the democracy of Japan. And so they are fighting against the Northern Koreans and the Chinese. Now the Chinese forces are now communist, and when you guys view the lecture on how China becomes communist, this will be a little bit more clear for you. But the North Koreans are going to use Chinese communist forces in part of the war. They signed an armistice in 1953 that says we're going to stop blowing each other up, and they created the DMZ. The DMZ is the demilitarized zone. North Korea is not allowed to put troops there. South Korea is not allowed to put troops there. And so the troops that are actually along the DMZ are technically UN troops. And the UN doesn't actually have their own troops, so it's a lot of US soldiers. There's a lot of US soldiers, the British, French, all those guys are regulating the DMZ. And the DMZ actually has a huge minefield between it, so you don't want to go walking around in between the DMZ. So it's not like you can just run from North Korea to South Korea. That's not going to happen. You will get blown up. So, and the United States often has been urged to sign agreements against minefields, but we won't do it because of this one between North and South Korea. In 1953, Stalin dies, and the Cold War kind of thaws out a little bit. There's this time period where nobody's really aggressive. The successor, Khrushchev, of Stalin is not as aggressive against capitalism as Stalin was. And so, and a lot of times the United States wasn't even sure if Khrushchev was still in power. There were times where the Soviet Union seemed very kind of bipolar in its actions. One day it would say one thing, and the next day do something totally different. And so there was definitely some internal issues going on within the Soviet Union associated with Khrushchev's reign. Here's a map of the demilitarized zone. You can see the red line. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, is to the left. also known as West, of Korea. So it's pretty close to the DMZ, which is somewhat of a dangerous place to put it, but it was also on purpose to put it in Seoul, because kind of signaling to the North Koreans, fine, come try to take our capital. It's not going to work. So this line still exists. And like I said, the DMZ is protected by minefields and by UN soldiers. Another proxy war in Asia is the Vietnam conflict. This is also known as the Second Indo-Chinese War. The First Indo-Chinese War was when the French left this area, because this area was colonized, imperialized by the French during the imperialization movement in the late 1800s. Well, the French, obviously, with World War II, you're not allowed to have an empire anymore. The French had to leave the region. And so there was fighting over borders between Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So the Vietnam conflict lasts from November of 1955 to April of 1975. That's a very long war. And again, I notice I keep saying conflict because it's technically not a war. The United States never declared war on anyone. The only reason why we were there was to protect the idea of democracy for the South Vietnamese. The North is going to be supported by Communist USSR, Communist China. The South is going to be supported by the U.S. And believe it or not, a lot of Filipinos fought for us and helped the South Vietnamese as well. And a couple other different democratic states like Britain and France and a couple other people did send in troops. The largest country to send in troops was the United States. The easiest way to kind of do the Vietnam War is by president. So in 1961, under Eisenhower sends in a whole bunch of troops. And then again, JFK sends another huge amount of set of troops in 1962. So we're sending in military to protect the South Vietnamese. At first, we were just advising the South Vietnamese. What Eisenhower was doing was really just kind of giving the South Vietnamese military advice, government advice, and things of that nature. It escalated officially in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. There was a boat in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is a waterway near Vietnam, that basically blew up, and so the United States sends in a huge amount of troops. Okay, this is under President Nixon. In 1964, the U.S. Congress issues the Tonkin Resolution. I'm sorry, this is under President Johnson, not Nixon. The Tonkin Resolution will basically send in a huge amount of troops that the president, we never declared war, but that Congress is the only country, is the part of the government that declares war. So Congress refused to declare war, but it did allow the president to send in troops, unlimited numbers of troops into Vietnam. And that's when the draft starts. So gentlemen, when you turn 18, you will register for the U.S. draft. And you will, basically what ended up happening was there was, people were very against this war because it was an ideological war. Why are we there? Why are we involved in this? It's costing billions of dollars and lots of U.S. lives. And then the draft started, and the violence in the United States just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And keep in mind, in the 1960s, we also had the civil rights movement happening at the same time. If you have not watched Forrest Gump, now is the time to watch it. It gives you a really good idea of the protests against Johnson and against this draft idea. You guys may have some relatives who fought Vietnam. And Vietnam was a nasty, nasty war for people to be involved in. There's huge amounts of PTSD associated with it. And one of the reasons why there's a little bit of an increased PTSD associated with the war in Vietnam is the drug use from the troops that were over there. There was a huge amount of drug use being from the American troops. Vietnam was just a nasty, nasty place for people to be. And it wasn't even a war officially. So keep that in mind. Vietnamization began under Nixon in 1969. Vietnamization is the idea of training the South Vietnamese. We went back to what Eisenhower originally intended when he started to send people into South Vietnam. We were trying to train the South Vietnamese to run their own war and defend themselves because people wanted us out of the war. Johnson didn't even run for re-election because everybody was so against the draft and everybody was so against what he was doing in Vietnam that he didn't even bother to run. Nixon is on the opposite side of the political spectrum, so one of the things that he was running on was lessening our presence in Vietnam. He also Nixon also had a policy of cutting supplies to the northern Vietnamese by blockading the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ho Chi Minh Trail was just the supply lines that were getting supplies to the North Vietnamese. This is something that a lot of people have used throughout history to try to end a war, is by cutting supplies. And it's not going to necessarily be very successful at all. They will finally have a conference in Paris. Notice Paris, again, pops up as another Paris Peace Conference. So we have, Paris is often times where people go to kind of make agreements. And the northern and southern Vietnamese are going to make agreements to stop killing each other. Totally doesn't work. The U.S. is still pulling out of Vietnam this whole time, even though the peace agreements at the Paris Peace Conference were not actually, or the Paris Peace Accord were not actually being used. And in 1975, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, will fall. If you've seen the Broadway musical Miss Saigon, that's what that is about. It's actually about the evacuation of American troops from Saigon. It was very dramatic. So we get all of our American troops out of Saigon by 1975, and Vietnam is still today a communist state. However, since most of your clothes are made in Vietnam, their economy is obviously not a communist economic policy, but in government, it is technically still a communist state. Going down into Latin America, we can consider the Cuban Revolution a proxy war. So the Cuban Revolution lasts from 1953 to 1959. Batista was president from 1940 to 1944, and then he took over again in 1952 in a military coup, and he cancels elections. U.S. policy, we like elections, we like people to have democracy, so we're not really okay with this. Cuba, part of the reason why Cuba was kind of struggling, they had water problems. They also had a lot of organized crime, and Batista was using that organized crime and those kind of mob-like families in order to run his country. And the United States controls the entire economy of Cuba. We had a huge amount of companies down in Cuba. It's 90 miles off the coast of Florida, so it makes sense. This was kind of a hub for business between the United States and Latin America. We had our presence in Cuba since the Spanish-American War, since the whole Remember the Maine, 1898. Teddy Roosevelt went in and kind of did some stuff in Cuba. So we had a huge presence in Cuba. Batista, in order to remain in power, pledged to be anti-communist, anti-socialist, and he's aided by the United States in his military coup. We actually helped Batista come to power and cancel elections. That's very not ideologically okay for what we stand for. So Castro, who was a lawyer, wanted to try to change things legally. He felt that there could be legislation to force elections, and the United States was somewhat involved in keeping Batista, a military dictator, in power. That's, again, against the beliefs of the United States. He would be arrested several times. His brother was arrested. But all political prisoners were freed in 1955, which gives Castro an opportunity to organize. He actually spends a lot of time in Mexico organizing. He does come to the United States to organize as well. And his original intent was to have a democratic system. His original intent was to create a democracy for Cuba and oust Batista. Castro meets with other revolutionaries in Latin America, like Che. You guys might be familiar with Che Guevara, who would help him in what was called the 26th of July movement. The United States places an embargo on Cuba. The mafia moves out, and U.S. businesses leave because there's this revolution happening between these Castro guys and these Batista guys, and we decide we're done. If you've seen Dirty Dancing Havana Nights, then that is what that movie is all about. Not a very good movie, but it's been on Netflix lately, so I thought I would mention it. Support for Batista is going to weaken. He was a scary military dictator guy. Castro was a great speaker. all those kind of charismatic things that we saw with Lenin and Hitler and Stalin. And Batista runs away. He, of course, came to the United States. We will give him refuge. And Castro officially takes over in December of 1958. In 1959, Castro came to the United States and spoke to Congress. And he said Batista was a bad guy. He says that Batista is killing people. He's remaining in power because he's killing people. Please help us be a democratic state. Please don't not like us. Please love Cuba. The United States says, no, we don't like you. So Castro decided to become a communist. He needed support, so he went for the side that was against the United States, which means that he's going to become a best friend of Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. Castro nationalizes everything in Cuba. Nationalization is where you make industries, government industries. So any profit that comes from a nationalized industry, it goes to the government. So this is how the governments are going to fund their communist programs and how they're going to be able to kind of create that economic equality. He nationalizes everything in Cuba. There's no more U.S. businesses in Cuba anyway. The Soviet Union was very outspoken about its support of Castro, and which will lead to the Bay of Pigs. There was a huge amount of Cuban refugees coming out of Cuba and landing in Miami. And so what we decided to do was train those Cubans, give them guns, send them back to Cuba without telling Castro that we had trained them. We just said, hey, we're giving your people back. And then they were supposed to revolt, and we were going to come in with our Navy and our Air Force and take out Castro. Makes sense. The people get to Cuba, they start their revolt, the Navy and the Air Force never show up. Huge embarrassment for the Kennedy administration. Kennedy is destroyed in public because obviously all these people that we sent back to communist Cuba are going to be killed in this attempted coup of Castro. Then in 1964, we find out because we were flying planes over Cuba, taking pictures, which we were not supposed to be doing. We found out that Cuba had a bunch of missiles coming in from the USSR. That's a little scary. Why are they putting missiles 90 miles off the coast of Florida? This is a big deal. We find out about it, but we need Cuba to admit, and we need the Soviet Union to admit that they were doing this. And they refused to say, no, we don't. They kept saying it over and over again. We don't have missiles in Cuba. We don't have missiles in Cuba. You're lying. The United States is full of it. We don't have missiles in Cuba. JFK is very, very good at managing to get the Soviet Union to admit that they do have missiles in Cuba. And technically, we kept flying over Cuba and taking pictures, but we weren't supposed to be doing that. So we had to get people we had to prove that they had the missiles there without admitting that we were spying on them. So it became very, very complex, and JFK did a great job of ending this crisis. What he did was he embargoed ships. He created a quarantine where the ships were not allowed into the Cuban space and we were allowed to board them. Eventually, the USSR ships started to turn around for some reason. Maybe they had something on the ships that they weren't supposed to. Eventually the Soviet Union does pull their missiles out of Cuba. Cuba would send support to other communist revolutions throughout the Cold War. The embargo of Cuban goods started with JFK and ended with President Obama last year. Cuba is now open to the United States for the first time since JFK's presidency, since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1964. Chile. The United States supported the election of Salvador Allende, who was at first a capitalist. So we wanted Allende to be in office. Chile became dependent on foreign aid, and Allende wanted to institute more socialist Marxist policies. Well, the United States doesn't want that to happen. And so in 1964, there may or may not have been a coup in Chile where a new guy gets put in power. We find out that Chile was probably supporting, he came out against Bay of Pigs. He was probably supporting Castro in Cuba. We don't like this. And so Nixon actually came out and said that Chile was becoming another Cuba. and 1970, and we needed to control it, we needed to stop it. The United States may or may not have spent $8 million in helping to overthrow Marxism in Chile from 1970 to 1973. This is where the CIA is involved. This is where super secret spies are involved. The U.S. was training and arming the military to overthrow the government. And we get a leader called Pinochet, who rises to power in 1973. Pinochet happened to be democratic and happened to not be Marxist and happened to, manage to take out the Allende power. And again, the involvement of the United States in this was very hush-hush until President Clinton said that we need to figure out what happened there. And the Freedom of Information Act allowed Clinton to start to release and research what was actually happening in Chile. Up to this point, the U.S. citizens had no clue that we were spending money in Chile. This is all new information for U.S. citizens once Clinton was in office. Guatemala. A guy named Guzman seizes unused, basically, the United Fruit Company was a U.S.-owned company that owned a lot of land in Guatemala, but they weren't farming all of the land. But the people of Guatemala were hungry. So there's all this land that wasn't even being farmed, wasn't even being used. And so Guzman decides to seize the unused land, and the government, the Guatemalan government tried to pay the United Fruit Company for the land, and the United States said, no, that's not enough money. So Eisenhower may or may not have sent in the CIA to overthrow Guzman. So the CIA creates a new Guatemalan army under a guy named Armas, and Armas wins. Guzman ends up out of power. He establishes his own government, gives the land back to the company, and he happened to use torture to control anybody who was against him. So again, the United States is putting someone in power who is using torture or using military means to maintain its power. And again, this is all secret. This is all new information in the past 20 years that people are finding out that the United States was involved in this in the 1970s. And Guatemala has been in a civil war ever since. It's still in a civil war. And the Mayan Indians are being killed in Guatemala as a result of the civil war, which one of your genocide groups will actually cover. Nicaragua. The CIA was using Nicaragua to get guns to the Guatemalan army that we were trying to overthrow Guzman. And the government of Nicaragua started to try to limit United States involvement in this issue with Guatemala. There happened to be a group of Marxists called Sandinistas that showed up, and they were against the Somoza family. They were Marxists, and they take power officially in 1979. So the Sandinistas will win. We don't want Marxists in our backyard. We don't want Marxists in Nicaragua. But President Carter is in office. Carter had a very different attitude about communism in Latin America. He felt that the United States shouldn't spend that much money in Latin America, that the United States should kind of leave Latin America alone. President Carter has won a Nobel Peace Prize because of his ideas about this kind of thing. And Carter recognizes the Sandinista government in 1979. Reagan gets elected in 1980, and then all of a sudden, we have a war happening in Nicaragua. Contras are little military groups that were there to overthrow the Sandinistas. They happened to have guns that said made in the USA. How did they get those guns? We don't know. Officially, we have no idea. Turns out, the United States was funding these Contra groups, and the Congress said no more money for these Contras in 1984. And then all of a sudden, they were still getting money, and it turns out what was happening was the Reagan administration, someone in the Reagan administration, was selling guns to Islamic extremists in Iran and using that money to fund the Contras in Nicaragua. You can YouTube the Iran-Contra affair, and you will find Reagan's speech where he says he didn't really know this was happening. In 1989, the UN said that peacekeeping troops would go in. You can see that even little children were part of these Contras. And the UN would help monitor election and take the guns away from the Contras. The Sandinistas are still a political party in Nicaragua. They are Marxist in ideology. They're still there, but they aren't necessarily as powerful as they once were in the 1970s. In El Salvador, there was an oil crisis, and people didn't like the government of El Salvador. Coffee, which was super important, was a super important export of El Salvador, was only held by 2%. The wealth from that was only being held by 2% of the population. So there's a huge economic disparity in El Salvador. So you end up with very leftist socialist groups combining into what's called the FMLN. And in 1980, the communists joined the FMLN, and we don't like that. We don't want communists in our backyard. I cannot say that enough. So death squads and child soldiers were used in this 12-year civil war, and the U.S. supported the government throughout the Civil War because they did not want the leftist government to be in charge. This war is considered a dirty war because we're not sure exactly how many people died. There's tons of people missing. The UN says that 75,000 people were killed throughout the war. El Salvador is currently a democracy with the FMLN as still a strong political party. Ethiopia. We have an emperor who comes to power in 1930, and he tries to modernize Ethiopia. Ethiopia is not doing so well today, so obviously this modernization fails. It was interrupted when the Italians invaded during World War II. That did not help things. Ethiopia would regain its independence pretty quickly, especially once Mussolini was a very bad leader. And once Mussolini is executed in Italy, Ethiopia goes back to the emperor that was already in place. In 1974, we have this oil crisis again that's happening, which led to discontent amongst the Ethiopians. They had high unemployment, food issues, border issues. Modernization was not working. So taxi drivers go on strike in Ethiopia, which led to a Marxist-Leninist revolt backed by the USSR. So there's a communist attempt to overthrow the government. Ethiopia does become communist, and they support Somalia with the USSR and Cuba. A bunch of other people are supporting the Ethiopian communist government. There's a Red Terror where people were killed who were anti-communist. This is when many people left Ethiopia. And in the 1980s, a new famine hit, which will also bring a huge amount of refugees out of Ethiopia. 8 million died as a result of this famine, and the communist regime was officially overthrown because the USSR in the 1980s was struggling, and they weren't sending money to people anymore, and so that's partly why the communist government's going to fail. In 2006, Ethiopia held trials for those involved in the Red Terror. It has been labeled a genocide by Ethiopia, but not by the United Nations. Today, Ethiopia does have free elections in practice, but in reality, it's still very, very split between the different political parties. It's radical. They still have food issues. They haven't modernized. They haven't industrialized, so it's still a problem. Angola. Angola had a civil war from 1975 to 2002, which will be discussed more when we talk about decolonization. Part E talks about the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which ends the Cold War. Khrushchev. Khrushchev takes over after Stalin. He actually gives a secret speech. It's called a secret speech because we didn't know about it. The Western powers didn't know about it until 1991. We're finding more and more out about the Soviet Union as more and more research goes on now that it's just Russia and we can get into their archives. So it turns out that Khrushchev said that Stalin was a bad guy, that perhaps killing 20 million people was not a good idea. This is why Khrushchev's power is controversial. We aren't really sure how much power he ever had. He starts this program of de-Stalinization, which allows people to talk, which allows people to not necessarily be killed or sent off to gulags and work camps. And he's seen as a liberator for the USSR. And there's a shift in the resources of the USSR as well. Khrushchev felt that peaceful coexistence with capitalism was possible. This is going to be called détente. Détente is the idea that we can live in the world where capitalism and communism both function. He wanted cultural freedoms for the citizens of the USSR, and he actually encouraged a little bit of resistance in the satellite states. This will lead to revolts in both Poland and Hungary. In Poland, it was actually a little bit successful. In Hungary, the Soviet troops show up and completely violently crush the revolt. This is what I'm talking about the Soviet Union being bipolar under Khrushchev. We don't know what's going on. One day they give Poland a little bit more independence, the next day they take out Hungary. So it's it's not literally day by day, but it's very confusing in regards to what the Soviet Union's goals are during Khrushchev's reign. It's very confusing as to what Khrushchev is doing in general. Brezhnev takes over in 1964. Khrushchev's power just ends. It's a little unclear exactly how that happens. Again, we're still researching on that. People supported Brezhnev because Khrushchev's policy towards the West was unstable. Like I said, we don't know what he's doing. Party members were afraid Khrushchev would turn on them and do a reverse Stalinism and kind of kill the people who didn't like communism. And there wasn't enough food. And so people were hungry. So when people are hungry, they're going to ask for a new leader. Czechoslovakia in 1968. Basically what happens in Prague Spring is Dubek, who was a reformer who wanted to change communist policies, takes over. And there was a very Stalinist guy in charge. And so he wanted a socialist system with democracy. He wanted people to vote for social systems. He wanted more of like a German type of system or a French type of system rather than the strict communist system. One of the things that he does is he relaxes censorship, and the USSR was super afraid that Czechoslovakia was going to become an ally with NATO powers and that Czechoslovakia was going to switch sides. So they send this massive force into Czechoslovakia, and this is a huge military force. Literally, like, the people are asleep, they wake up, there's Soviet tanks outside their window. So Brezhnev issues the Brezhnev Doctrine that says that the USSR can intervene in any satellite state if the ideology of communism is in danger. This is very different than what Khrushchev was saying. This is very different than the Khrushchev reign. And so the United States is actually fearful of Brezhnev's power. Becomes a little bit more tension-filled. Brezhnev tries to save communism by invading Czechoslovakia. Unfortunately, they didn't have any food, and they actually had to buy grains from the United States. Big slap in the face to the ideology of communism. The Soviet Union can't even provide food for their people, and the United States happen to have some for them. In 1980, McDonald's will open in Moscow. It's a sign of the ending of communism, and Brezhnev will die in 1982, and that's really kind of the end for the Soviet Union. Like I said, with Ethiopia, the USSR stopped giving money to Ethiopia in the 1980s. This is where that was starting to happen. Brezhnev's reign was unable to save communist ideologies and was unable, because communism as an economic system doesn't work. And so, and they were not reforming because they were so stuck on the ideology. And we'll see that's very different than what China does. Gorbachev is going to rule the USSR in 1982. He spoke openly about problems. So one of the issues, parts of the Cold War was the arms race with the United States. I have nukes, you have nukes, my ships are bigger than your ships. Hey, look, we're putting a satellite in space, look how awesome we are. So it's back and forth, back and forth. And so Gorbachev said that, hey, we should stop pointing nukes at each other. He also wanted to deal with weak farming and weak industry. He felt that things had to be changed. And so he created perestroika. And perestroika is internal reforms. He decentralizes decision making and starts to do more votes amongst the legislative assembly. He also issued an idea called glasnost. Glasnost is where the citizens of the Soviet Union were supposed to talk to their government and say, this is what we need. Here's an idea for reform. He reduces the role of the Communist Party, and he introduces and allows private ownership of business. So this is where they are introducing capitalism. This is where they're getting rid of their communist economic policies. It's too late. It's not going to work. Gorbachev is praised internationally. Obviously, we like Gorbachev a lot. Reagan met with Gorbachev on several occasions to work out nuclear arms agreements. And so Reagan and Gorbachev are really given credit for ending the Cold War. Gorbachev was against nuclear war. He ends the war in Afghanistan in 1987. In 1980, under Brezhnev, the communist government of the Soviet Union wanted to incorporate Afghanistan into the USSR, and they attacked Afghanistan. This is actually where Osama bin Laden comes into existence for the United States because he was involved in trying to liberate Afghanistan, and the United States was there to protect Afghanistan from communism. And then when we leave Afghanistan, that's when Osama bin Laden gets mad. He extends glasnost into Eastern European countries like Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and countries start to request withdrawal from the Soviet Union and try to get troops out of their country. Solidarity is a Polish, basically, movement against being communist. The economy was basically sucked, and in 1980 there was meat prices went up, and so there's a huge strike, and they wanted to have rights to form trade unions, freedom of speech, other reforms. The strike lasts for 18 days, and the Catholic Church is actually going to join in this, and this is where John Paul II, a pope that just recently died, becomes important. And martial law is declared, and they end all the freedoms gained. Solidarity leaders were arrested, so it backfires. 1983, all the people were freed again, and so solidarity continues. In 1988, new strikes start. USSR doesn't have the money or troops to come in this time. The union was legalized. They have elections in 1989. Poland will become the first non-communist country in the Soviet bloc. Hungary will have the Communist Party changes their name to the Socialist Party, and they have free elections in 1990. In 1989, the Prime Minister was beaten and arrested, and he resigned, which would make sense. And they open the wall, and the wall falls down. This is televised throughout the world. It is symbolic of the end of the Cold War. And the wall is destroyed by citizens. And David Hasselhoff will come and perform on top of the wall because the Germans love David Hasselhoff. That's why that's funny in dodgeball. Czechoslovakia, they have protests. They have free elections in December. Bulgaria, they arrest all the communist leaders and they have free elections. And in Romania, they kill the last communist leader on Christmas Day and have free elections. So Gorbachev called a meeting of the USSR states. Only 8 out of the 15 even showed up. And so in 1991, they said, okay, we're done. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan all said, we're done with the Soviet Union. We're our own independent countries. No one fought it. Gorbachev said, okay, it's over. And that's the official end of the Cold War.